Okay, so welcome to our short introduction to the nuts and bolts of your endocrine system, right? This is our hormone messaging system, a chemical messaging system, as opposed to system using electrical impulses, which would be our nervous system, right? And the two actually do talk to each other as well, just to complicate things a little bit. So we're going to focus here basically on the basic differences between the two major classes of hormones, so water-soluble and fat-soluble hormones, and how they affect changes inside our cells and in our DNA. And we're going to define what a gland is and talk about the difference between a hormone and a neurohormone, as well as the difference between an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. And then we're going to do a quick overview of the major hormonal pathways that we're going to cover in class, during class time. We've tried to trim this down considerably from where we are in the past. So we'll just be hitting the big highlights. Okay, so basically we have two main things involved in our endocrine system, right? You have hormone production, or the release of hormones from a gland or from secretory tissues, and then you have the effect of the hormone, right? How it affects the changes in the cell. So this can either be binding to receptors on the outside of the cell and causing changes in the cell metabolism or gene expression, or by actually traveling into the cell and into the nucleus and affecting changes directly. Or a third option, travel into the cell and trigger changes in metabolism that way. So these basically the process of hormones causing changes in the cell metabolism and physiological responses is known as signal transduction. So this is basically the process of the hormone basically doing its job and affecting a change in the cell. So for example, we have the binding of epinephrine, right? This is AKA adrenaline. This is a hormone that is secreted by your adrenal gland sitting on top of your kidney. And one of the many effects of epinephrine, as we will talk about later, as an example, is binding to proteins on the outside of the cell, which, as you can see in this little flow chart, causes a change in several other proteins that are bound to the inside of the cell membrane. No, you do not have to memorize this metabolic pathway, at least not for this class. So don't worry about it for now. But this is just an example of how a hormone can cause a change to happen. So the hormone causes a change in the receptor protein, which then triggers a change along with some energy requirements in another protein, which triggers a change in another protein, which produces something called cyclic AMP. And remember, right, cyclic AMP is our your gas light, your low fuel light blinking, right? This is right. It starts out life as ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate, right? And then, okay, now I've used up that. I've got ADP. I still have one phosphate that I can hydrolyze to get energy. And now I'm down to AMP, right? Okay, this is the low fuel light. Hello, I need energy. And cyclic AMP basically binds to a particular protein kinase A, and essentially activates it, converts it from its inactive form to its active form. So another good example of, right, allosteric protein and enzyme regulation. And protein kinase A in its active form then basically promotes the hydrolysis of, or triggers the enzymes involved in the hydrolysis of glycogen to glucose, basically break it down. And oh, by the way, don't make glycogen right now, right? If you're in the middle of making glycogen, don't do that. So protein kinase A actually has two, its active form does two jobs. One, it helps to activate the enzymes involved in breaking down glycogen, and it also acts as an inhibitor on the enzymes involved in glycogen synthesis. So this is another good example of sort of an enzyme cascade of one thing that activates another thing activates another thing. But in this particular case, you have the hormone is starting the party by binding to that receptor on the outside of the cell, and the change that it gets affected is eventually the release of glucose by the cells into the bloodstream. Essentially, hey, we needed fuel, and we're going to release fuel. Interestingly enough, this is actually the same pathway that gets triggered by glycogen in response to low blood sugar. So glycogen is actually going to bind to different types of receptors on the outside of the cell, but the metabolic pathway that gets turned on is exactly the same. So you basically have two different switches for the same metabolic pathway, and that is very true across our bodies, and we know we can do this with our genes as well, right? The same molecule can turn one gene off and turn another one on at the same time. Okay, so how do cells get from the gland or the secretory tissue that's making them to what we refer to as their target cell, basically the cells that they need to trigger the change in, right? Because there's the reason that you're making the hormone in the first place, right? So hormones fall into two basic broad types. We have your just straight up regular hormones, and then we have what we were talking about in class, which are hormones called local regulators. And these ones act over very short distances. Their target cell is usually right next door. It's a neighboring cell, or they don't have to travel too terribly far. So they can just diffuse across the interstitial fluid in between the cells to get from the cell that's producing them to the cell where they're going to cause whatever change that they're causing, right? So hormones, of course, as I mentioned in class, can cause changes in metabolic pathways. They can cause changes in other cell behavior, such as changes in uptake or secretion of certain molecules. And of course, they can cause changes in gene expression. And there's a few ways that they can do that, which we will get to in just a second. So local regulators don't have to go terribly far, and they are often water-soluble or hydrophilic molecules because they're going to be just diffusing across the interstitial fluid in between cells. But other hormones have to travel a significant distance in order to get to their target cell, right? They might have to go from one side of the body to the other side of the body. And to do that, they have to get out of the gland or cell that's making them and tissue that's making them and into the bloodstream, and then get to the target cell and cause the change, right? So we have two broad classes of hormones here. We have water-soluble hormones and we have lipid-soluble hormones. As the name implies, water-soluble hormones dissolve easily in water, right? And why might that be? Yes, so they're going to be hydrophilic, right? Because they are often proteins, so they have surfaces that are covered with either charged or polar areas, right? And so they are going to be able to, once they're exported through exocytosis, right, from the cell that made them, they can easily enter the bloodstream and travel anywhere without any help, right? Because again, they're water soluble. Our blood the portion of our blood is water, so it's an aqueous environment. So hydrophilic molecules are going to dissolve and run freely throughout our bloodstream. It's not a problem, right? Now the glands that are making them still have to use exocytosis to secrete them because we're still dealing with proteins. Even if they're small, they're still proteins, right? They're still likely have hydrophilic or polar surfaces, and they're just generally too big. Even if they're a small protein, we're still dealing with, you know, hundreds, possibly thousands of atoms. So they're too big to just cross to cross the membrane to leave the cell on their own. So you have them in a vesicle that merges in the process of exocytosis and dumps the products into the bloodstream, and now they can go anywhere, right? Okay, so because water-soluble hormones really cannot cross the plasma membrane without help, this means that to affect any changes in their target cell, they are usually binding to receptors on the outside of the cell, right? So they bind to a receptor protein, as we can see here in this little visual image, and that the binding of the hormone to the receptor protein triggers a set of changes inside the cell, much like our example of epinephrine that we looked at earlier, right? Where the binding of epinephrine to the receptor protein triggered changes in another protein, which triggered changes in another protein, which sets off an enzyme cascade, which finally causes the response, right? And so this is a typical pathway for our water-soluble hormones, is binding to a surface receptor, and then that binding triggers changes in molecules in the cytoplasm, either through enzyme activity. It increases the solubility of certain molecules so that they can move as they need to. So you have increase in molecule uptake or molecule secretion. Water-soluble hormones can cause changes in gene regulation, typically, again, by binding to receptors on the outside of the cell, and that, again, the binding causes changes in the receptor cell protein, which sets off a sort of a chain reaction whereby maybe an activator molecule is synthesized or released, which can cross the plasma membrane around the nucleus, right? The nuclear membrane, which is also a lipid bilayer. So either that activator molecule is transported inside the nucleus where it can turn genes on or off, or it causes it's either transported directly or the activator that's released is lipid soluble and it can cross the membrane into and go directly into the nucleus and affect those changes itself. So essentially, water-soluble hormones mostly trigger kind of chain reactions inside the cell that either end with changes in gene regulation or changes in a direct molecular or metabolic response inside the cytoplasm. So again, changing enzyme activity, solubility, formation of cytoskeleton components and things like that, which can cause the shape of the cell to change. So there's a whole bunch of actions, what word I'm searching for, consequences that can happen as a result of the binding of water-soluble hormones to those outside receptors. So they certainly can cause changes in gene regulation, and they can, of course, affect a whole bunch of other types of changes inside the cell. Okay, so lipid-soluble hormones have kind of the opposite issue, right? So being fat-soluble, right, they are going to be able to cross the plasma membrane very easily, right? Even if they are not super small, because they're nonpolar, right? They can cross the membrane no problem. So this means that getting out of the cell that makes them is easy, and getting into their target cell is also easy. Anybody spot the intermediate problem? Exactly. So the problem, of course, is getting through the bloodstream because you are lipid soluble. And this is true for other nonpolar molecules that are traveling in our blood as well, like cholesterol. They need a little bit of help. Basically, help them is they need an escort molecule because they are nonpolar. So they're not going to play nicely in the aqueous environment that is our bloodstream. So getting out of the cell is easy, they often need transport proteins to help them get from the cell that's making them to their target cell, where essentially they get dropped off at their target cell. They can cross the membrane with no problem, right? And this means that they may actually, they can affect changes in the cytoplasmic responses. They certainly can do that. The receptors are often inside the cell because, again, the hormone itself has no problem crossing the membrane. So it doesn't need to bind to an outside receptor. The receptor is inside the cell, and that's going to cause changes, again, in cytoplasmic response. Or, again, they can cross into the nuclear membrane, as we can see on the image here. There's no receptor to help them get into the nucleus because they're fat soluble. So they can just cross right into the nucleus there and bind to receptors maybe inside the nucleus, or act as an activator or a repressor molecule directly, or cause any other associated change in gene regulation directly by crossing into the inside the nucleus, right? So that, again, we typically have steroid hormones are a large class of lipid-soluble hormones. This includes all of our sex hormones are all steroid-based, right? Most of them actually use cholesterol as a building block, right? And of course, we know we need cholesterol for our cell membrane function as well. And so those hormones typically bind to, again, the receptors inside the cell. And then sometimes that whole complex moves into the nucleus, as we can, as I've written here, or again, they can go directly into the nucleus and affect those changes in gene expression inside the nucleus directly. And so by binding to the receptor, they cause those changes in gene expression, most typically with our fat-soluble hormones, although they can cause other metabolic changes in the cell. They're not limited to just changes in gene expression. They just tend to be used for that, most likely because they are lipid-soluble and they can cross those membranes without any problems. So both fat-soluble and water-soluble hormones can cause changes in different types of cells. So basically they can trigger more than one kind of response, and they typically do, right? So the hormones will bind to a certain kind of receptor on one type of tissue in one location, and they'll bind to a different receptor on that same type of tissue, but in a different location in the body, or they can bind to the same kind of receptor, but on different kinds of tissue, right? So the tissue itself is different and binds to the hormone and causes a different change, or it's the same kind of tissue, but the hormone is binding to a different kind of receptor, and the difference in the receptor triggers a different change in the tissue, again, based on the type of receptor that's binding to the hormone. So we have two different, basically, ways that the same hormone can cause different changes in different cells, either based on the type of tissue that they're binding to or based on the type of receptor that's being used. And again, a good example of this is epinephrine, again. So binding to different types of receptors and triggering different responses in different tissues and different kinds of cells makes sense, right, on a whole body level, right? If you're trying to coordinate a physiological response to a situation, or even just affecting homeostasis, you need to likely coordinate all the different systems, right? Our respiratory system and our circulatory system and our digestive system and our excretory system. All those things need to be working together. They need to all be on the same page, so to speak. So again, epinephrine is a good example of this. So this, again, is the hormone that's involved in triggering kind of our acute stress response or our fight or flight response. And this is a response that begins on a neurological level, but neurons trigger the release of epinephrine from the adrenal gland. And so once it's released, it's a water-soluble hormone. It goes everywhere, right, in our bloodstream. and it causes different changes both in different types of tissues as well as changes in the same kind of tissue by binding to different kinds of receptors. So for example, we have the change in liver cells that we already talked about, where binding with epinephrine to the receptor on the surface triggers an enzyme cascade that results in the release of glucose into the bloodstream. So there's your fuel supply for gotta run for my life, gotta fight for my life, right? At the same time, you want to increase blood flow to your skeletal muscle and your brain, and increase your breathing rate and things like that. Epinephrine is also a bronchial dilator, so you increase with every breath, you increase the amount of oxygen that you're taking in the air that you're breathing, because you're increasing how much air you're breathing. But there are certain things that we want to not worry about, right? As I was mentioning in the circulatory EdPuzzle that you guys have seen. We can't open all of our, basically we can't dilate all of our blood vessels at once. We can't increase blood supply to everything in our body, because that's just going to cause the blood pressure everywhere to drop, which of course means that the blood is not getting where it needs to go anywhere. It's kind of an all or nothing thing. So instead, our body basically, if we have to increase the blood supply to one area, quite often we have to restrict the blood supply someplace else. And so in this situation, right, we have epinephrine binding to certain types of receptors. Again, don't memorize whether it's A or B. A certain type of receptor on smooth muscle cells, which line our blood vessels, all of our blood vessels, right, are lined with smooth muscle. They bind to the receptors on smooth muscle that lines our skeletal muscle and causes those cells to basically to relax, right, which allows the blood vessels to dilate or get bigger, which increases the volume of blood that's flowing to your skeletal muscle. At the same time, they're binding to different receptors on smooth muscle that lines our blood vessels, but in this case, the smooth muscle cells are supplying around the blood supply to our intestines. And they're lining basically those muscles that are those precapillary sphincters, right? So by binding to these receptors, it actually causes a different response because it's binding to a different kind of receptor. And so instead of relaxing, right, the blood vessel muscle cell, the smooth muscle cell contracts. And that restricts, right, that basically closes off the blood vessel, right? Effectively, the diameter gets a lot smaller, which means blood supply is restricted to the capillary beds for our intestines, which makes sense, right? You only have so much blood. You don't need to be worrying about digesting food right now if you're running for your life or fighting for your life. So you want to increase your blood supply in some places and decrease it in others based on the receptor type. And so because the receptor type is different, you're going to get a different kind of change, even though it's the same overall tissue type. You're getting a different change based on the type of receptors. And those receptors are only present on those blood vessels in certain locations because we want them to respond a certain way. The smooth muscle cells that, for example, are feeding the blood supply to your kidneys also respond to epinephrine the same way. They have the alpha receptors on them. They respond the same way that our smooth muscles cells that are lining the blood vessels that are feeding into the capillary beds of our intestines do. So you can coordinate a response that way by having different cell types bind to the hormone and cause different changes based on the fact that it's a different type of cell, but you can also make different changes in the same kind of cell by binding to different kinds of receptors. So hormones are made by endocrine cells. Endocrine cells can be tissue cells that are found as part of an organ, such as our stomach. We also have them in our small intestine, in the duodenum. We also have them in our kidneys and some other organs, right? I also have endocrine cells. So endocrine cells are basically cells that make hormones, either water-soluble or lipid-soluble, either way. These tissue cells can also be grouped into organs themselves. And if they are, then we refer to that as a gland. So we have two main types of glands, mostly differentiated based on how they secrete the hormones, sort of where it goes, and whether they use a duct or not. A duct is basically a tube that connects the gland with the target tissue or the target cavity. So, for example, an endocrine gland is a gland that secretes the hormones directly into the surrounding fluid. So, no tube. The hormones go directly into the bloodstream, or they go directly into the interstitial fluid surrounding the gland itself, or surrounding the endocrine cells. An exocrine gland, by contrast, secretes a substance, right, that contains the hormones onto a body surface or into a cavity like your stomach or the lumen of your intestine, right, as examples of cavities. Your mouth is also technically a cavity. You can have cavities in your cavities. Sorry, bad joke. And exocrine glands have ducts. So your salivary glands, for example, are an exocrine gland. There is a duct, basically a little tube, that connects the gland itself with the cavity, which is our mouth, and the hormones are embedded in where's my brain going? The hormones are embedded in the substance that's then secreted into, right, the cavity. Likewise, our sebaceous glands, right, and our sweat glands are both exocrine glands. There are little ducts that connect the gland to where the substances are going, right? Sebaceous gland secretions are waxy, and again, those are containing hormones that are secreted onto the surface of our skin. Our sweat glands, those secretions are more liquid, more hydrophilic, but also going through a duct and being secreted onto the surface of our skin. An endocrine gland, again, no duct. The hormone is secreted directly into the surrounding fluid. So, trying to think of a good example of an endocrine gland. Oh, our adrenal gland. Yeah, great example. No duct, just dumps those hormones directly into our bloodstream. Our pituitary gland, likewise an endocrine gland, and so is our pineal gland in our brain that helps control our sleep cycle by making melatonin. Okay, so here's an overview of the major glands and hormones that we will be covering in class. The ones that are lined out, obviously, are ones that you don't have to worry about. I'm only including the hypothalamus for a couple of reasons. One, it's a good example of a neuroendocrine gland. So neuroendocrine glands are basically glands that are specialized neurons. And so they're making the hormones and then secreting them typically to another gland. Sometimes they dump them directly into the bloodstream, but it's basically a neuron that's making hormones, is essentially what a neuroendocrine gland is. We don't have too many examples of that, but the hypothalamus is a good one. So it's part of your brain, so it's receiving neural impulses from other parts of your brain and from sensory neurons. But it's also making and secreting hormones, either again directly into the bloodstream, but most typically releasing or inhibiting hormones for the anterior pituitary. So these are hormones that essentially stimulate or inhibit hormone release by the anterior pituitary gland, which is physically connected to the hypothalamus, and again, we'll go into more detail on this in class. Most of those are the hormones that we've lined out here, so you don't have to worry about them too much. But they're the hormones that are involved in stimulating the hormone released by other glands. The exception, of course, is ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which we will talk about more when we talk about regulating osmolarity and long-term stress also. That comes up in both of those places. So that is a hormone that is synthesized in the hypothalamus, but is released by the anterior pituitary. Likewise, both oxytocin and vasopressin are synthesized by the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary, which is also in physical contact with the hypothalamus. So we have a neuroendocrine gland, which is the hypothalamus, and then endocrine glands, which is the anterior pituitary, and the posterior pituitary, which we will talk about in relation to the highlighted, not the highlighted, but the hormones present here, as well as the thyroid hormone. And then, of course, we're also going to talk about long-term stress and our acute stress response, both of which are regulated by different parts of the adrenal gland. And then, of course, there's the pancreas, which makes insulin and glucagon, which regulate our blood sugar. So most of the hormones that we're going to be discussing are involved in some way of some kind of homeostasis or are regulating a very critical response system. Most of these glands are endocrine glands. They dump their products directly into a fluid. The pancreas, interestingly, is actually both. So it dumps insulin and glucagon directly into the bloodstream, but it secretes other products like bicarbonate and some other things through a duct to our small intestine. So it actually has properties of both, but for our purposes, we'll mainly be discussing it in regard to being an endocrine gland. And honestly, I included oxytocin mostly because we're not going to talk about reproductive behavior at all in this course, but we just don't have time. But I covered oxytocin because it is a good example of a positive feedback loop. So that's mostly why it's there. Oxytocin is also known as the tend and befriend hormone. So this is a hormone that is released. It's an endorphin. So it's released under situations where we're very stressed and in pain to help us to sort of power through and function, you know. But it's also released when in pleasurable circumstances like getting hugged and hugging someone. So that's something that is that contact in social animals like humans releases oxytocin in our brain, and it's sort of that happy, feel-good, belonging feeling that you get is mostly produced by oxytocin. Okay, so just to quickly illustrate the difference between an endocrine pathway and a neuroendocrine pathway, we don't have too many neuroendocrine examples, but we have quite a few endocrine examples. So an endocrine pathway, again, an endocrine gland is going to be secreting its products directly into the bloodstream. So a simple endocrine pathway, right, would be cells that are responding to a stimulus directly by secreting a particular hormone, which travels through the bloodstream to the target cells, binds to receptors, and causes a reaction in those cells, right, in those target cells. So you have signal transduction, remembering way back when at the beginning of this when we talked about transduction, right, that's the process of the hormone triggering that response, right, which can be binding to a receptor either on the surface of the cell or inside the cell, or having that hormone travel directly into the nucleus and affecting a change in gene regulation that way. So an example of a simple endocrine pathway is the control of our pH and our duodenum. So remember, we do have endocrine cells in our duodenum, right there at the entrance. Right, so we have chyme coming in from the stomach. It's got a pH of 2. That sets off these endocrine cells. Basically, it's a little sensory receptor system, and they are being stimulated by that change, right? And we know that the enzymes in your intestine do not function at a pH of 2, right? They function at a pH of 8. So really, really quickly, we've got to change the pH of the fluid in your intestine. It's coming in at 2. We've got to neutralize that acid. And so those endocrine cells, again, right at the entrance of the duodenum, are making a hormone that's called secretin. Secretin is actually an endocrine hormone. It's not a local regulator. It actually has to move through, from those endocrine cells to the pancreas via the bloodstream. So then it's not going directly. It has to kind of go through the bloodstream. And then it binds to the target cells, which in this case are the cells on the pancreas, and triggers the pancreas to release bicarbonate through ducts to the duodenum. So it's a very short circuit, but it has to go through the bloodstream. And again, the hormone that's stimulating the response is dumped directly into the bloodstream and affects that change in the target tissue, which in this case is actually another gland. Kind of interesting. So this could be, again, a different type of cell, or it could be another gland. It's not specific. A neuroendocrine pathway, on the other hand, right, remembering that a neuroendocrine gland is essentially a special neuron that is synthesizing hormones and releasing a hormone, either typically directly into the bloodstream. In the case of the hypothalamus, it may release it directly into another gland, which then releases it into the bloodstream. And we still consider that part of a neuroendocrine pathway because the stimulus is coming in through a neuron, not from another hormone, right? So it's coming in through it's coming in through a neuron, and that neural impulse from a sensory neuron, which we'll talk about this when we talk about the nervous system, stimulates the neurosecretory cell, which is basically, again, these are specialized neurons. In many cases, we're referring to the hypothalamus, which is part of your brain. And that specialized neuron then secretes what's known as a neurohormone, which is basically just a hormone that's being produced by a nerve cell into the bloodstream, or again into another gland, such as what we have happen in the case of the hypothalamus. So again, this is why one other reason I put in oxytocin in. It's a good example of a neuroendocrine pathway. So you have a suckling infant, right? If this is pulling on the tissue, right? Pulling on the nipple, right? So you have a physical response that's being, again, triggering sensory neurons in the nipple that transmit that signal up from the mammary gland up into the brain. The hypothalamus receives those sensory neuron signals, and it has made oxytocin already, and it's sort of storing it up in little vesicles. That nervous signal then triggers the release of the oxytocin from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland, and the posterior pituitary gland then releases the oxytocin into the bloodstream. So basically the posterior pituitary is sort of the delivery mechanism, I suppose. And then oxytocin travels through the bloodstream to receptors on the mammary glands, and that stimulates more milk production. So basically this is the positive feedback part, right? So you stimulate more milk production, which in turn stimulates more suckling by the infant because, hey, oh, food's coming, I'm going to drink it, right? I mean, they're just doing what they do. And that, again, is creating this kind of positive feedback loop of more sensory stimulus to, trigger more secretion of oxytocin, which stimulates even more milk production, right? So this, again, can explain why if someone is nursing and they stop nursing suddenly, their breasts swell, and it's actually quite painful because you have all of this supply and it has nowhere to go. because you had been getting positive feedback and now that's suddenly gone. So again, typically this is something, hormones change this response over time. The baby starts to, wean on solid food. They spend less time suckling. So you're able to sort of let it down easy. But if you stop it all of a sudden, then you have this over, I got too much milk and nowhere for it to go, really, which is kind of an interesting aside. Anyway, funny story. Okay. And so that is a simple neuroendocrine pathway as opposed to a simple endocrine pathway. So again, the only difference really, in both cases, you're dumping the hormones into the bloodstream and they have to travel through the bloodstream to the target tissue. The only difference really being where the hormone is made. So in a neuroendocrine pathway, the hormone is made inside specialized neurons called neurosecretory cells, of which the hypothalamus is one of those. And then it's secreting that hormone, which we refer to as a neurohormone, again, either to another gland in the case of the hypothalamus or directly into the bloodstream. So your adrenal gland is another example of a neuroendocrine pathway, or I should say not your adrenal gland, but the pathway to the adrenal medulla, which is the part of your adrenal gland that makes epinephrine. So it's under you have nerves that are going directly from your brain to the medulla of your adrenal gland, which is the center bit. And those neurons are stimulating the release of epinephrine, which is also a neurotransmitter. We're going to talk about that again when we talk about the nervous system. But it's stimulating those adrenal gland cells to release epinephrine into the bloodstream. And so that's another neuroendocrine pathway.